Hello, this is new Motivate story. Let's go started.
Ancient roots of motivation. The question that echoed. The year was 368 BCE, and the sun cast its golden warmth over the worn stone steps of the Lyceum. In the heart of Athens, the air buzzed not with the bustle of trade, but with thought, ideas that transcended time. A boy of 16, wide-eyed and barefoot, stood at the edge of the open-air classroom. His name was Kleon, son of a potter, but with the mind of a seeker. Though he had no place in the assembly of scholars, he came every morning just before sunrise to sit behind the cypress trees, hoping to catch fragments of wisdom from the philosophers who gathered there. That morning, Aristotle himself paced before a semicircle of eager students, robes stirring with each step. He paused, letting a hush fall. His voice, when it came, was calm but commanding. "Why do men act?" he asked, hands folded behind his back. "What compels them to rise each morning, to work, to love, to conquer, to create?" The students shifted. One brave soul responded, "Desire, master." "For pleasure." Aristotle nodded slowly. "Yes, but desire for what?" He turned his gaze toward the grove of trees, and for a moment, Kleon felt as if the philosopher saw right through the bark and into his heart. He held his breath. "Desire for something lasting," Aristotle continued. "We call it eudaimonia, not happiness in the sense of fleeting joy, but flourishing, the fulfillment of one's purpose. The soul aligned." He looked up at the sky. "But this pursuit, this striving, requires more than longing. It requires discipline. For what is purpose, if not the end of a long, arduous road?" Kleon exhaled slowly. He didn't understand every word, but he felt something ignite in his chest. A question. That night, he approached his father's workshop with dusty feet and trembling resolve. His father, Demetrios, was shaping a wide clay basin with thick, expert hands. "Father," Kleon said, voice wavering, "why do you work every day?" Demetrios didn't look up. "Because pots don't shape themselves. I mean, why do you care to make them beautiful?" This made the old man pause. He looked up, his eyes tired but not unkind. "Because we are more than hands," he said. "We are what we leave behind." Kleon sat on the floor, cross-legged, watching the clay spin. His father returned to his craft. The wheel hummed. The fire cracked. That night, Kleon couldn't sleep. Not from restlessness, but from clarity. The next morning, before dawn, he returned to the grove. This time, he didn't hide. "Boy," Aristotle said as the students settled. "You again." Kleon stepped forward. "Yes, master." "Why do you come?" "I want to know," Kleon said, his voice steadier than he felt. "I want to learn about the soul and purpose and how to walk that road." The students murmured. A potter's son among them? Aristotle studied him a moment. "Very well," he said finally. "Then answer this. What makes a life good?" Kleon thought. Not comfort, but effort. Striving towards something greater. The old philosopher's eyes gleamed. "We begin with truth," he said. And so began Kleon's journey, not of scholarship, but of transformation. The days that followed were unlike any Kleon had known. Each morning, he arrived at the Lyceum before the students, sweeping the steps clean, bringing water from the fountain, always listening. Aristotle allowed him to stay, not as a pupil, but as a shadow. In return for his diligence, he received morsels of wisdom, lessons not written in scrolls, but lived. The philosopher taught through questions more than answers. One afternoon, as the sun slanted through the olive trees, Aristotle handed Kleon a wax tablet and stylus. "Today," he said, "you write." Kleon looked at the blank surface. "What shall I write, master?" "Your aim," Aristotle said. "Not the aim of a potter's son or a student, but of a man. What is your purpose?" Kleon hesitated. His hand trembled over the wax. I don't know." Aristotle smiled faintly. "Then write what you feel, and do not lie to yourself." Kleon etched carefully, "To live rightly, to find meaning in labor and learning, to become wise, so that I might help others find their path, too." The philosopher nodded as he read. "Good. You seek not only your own flourishing, but others. That is the mark of virtue. But how do I stay true?" Kleon asked. "What if the world tempts me, distracts me, or I lose sight of the path?" "Discipline," Aristotle said. "Not merely repetition or control, but an allegiance to your aim. The hexis, a trained state of character. He picked up a stone and held it out. This rock will never change its shape unless acted upon by force. But you, Kleon, you are flesh and soul. You can shape yourself if you will it. Kleon clenched the tablet in his hands. For the first time, he believed he could. Yet, the real test came not from philosophy, but life. One evening, as he returned home, he found his father kneeling beside a shattered kiln. The roof beam had collapsed. The pots, weeks of work, lay in ruins. Demetrios sat in silence, his face a mask of quiet grief. "I'll help," Kleon said, kneeling beside him. His father looked at him, the clay still fresh on his hands. "You have your books now. Go to them." But Kleon shook his head. "I've learned nothing if I let you carry this alone." They worked through the night, gathering pieces, salvaging what they could. At dawn, soot-covered and bone-weary, they sat together beside the cold hearth. "You're changing," Demetrios said at last. Kleon looked to the horizon. "I want to understand more than ideas. I want to understand how they live in the world." His father nodded, eyes closed. "Then remember this. Discipline is not in how you study, but how you rise after the kiln collapses." The next morning, Aristotle found him dozing by the academy steps, ash still on his tunic. "You look like a soldier returning from battle," he said with a chuckle. "Perhaps I am," Kleon said, rubbing his eyes. "A battle of soul against despair." Aristotle's face turned serious. "Then you have understood something deep. Philosophy is not comfort. It is the torch in the cave. It is the courage to look inward and still keep walking." That day, Kleon was allowed to sit inside the circle. Years passed. Athens changed, as cities do. But at the Lyceum, under the ever-bending olive trees, the pursuit of wisdom continued. Kleon, once a potter's son lingering in shadows, now walked among the students as a peer. His hair had grown longer, his face more defined, his eyes steady. Still, he remained hungry. One summer morning, as the cicadas buzzed and heat shimmered on marble walls, Aristotle called the students together. "Today," he said, "you will each answer one question. A question more dangerous than war, for it has no easy answer. What is the greatest obstacle to a meaningful life?" The students responded one by one. "Fear," said one. "Desire," said another. "Ignorance," said a third. When it came to Kleon, he stood in silence for a moment, then replied, "Forgetting." Aristotle raised an eyebrow. "Explain." "We forget our purpose. We forget why we began. In comfort or hardship, we lose the thread. It is not only the lack of wisdom that destroys us, but abandoning what we already know to be true." The philosopher nodded slowly. "Yes, memory is not just of the mind, it is of the soul. Discipline is the act of remembering." That night, Kleon walked alone by the river Ilissos. The moon reflected on its surface, broken and shimmering. He thought of all he had learned, not just the teachings, but the lived truths, that discipline was not rigidity, but devotion. That purpose was not a moment, but a path. That the soul, when guided by reason and virtue, flourished not only in success, but in struggle. He sat by the bank and took out his old wax tablet. The etchings had faded, worn by time and touch, but he could still read them, to live rightly, to help others find their path. The next day, he approached Aristotle. "Master," he said, "I wish to teach." Aristotle looked at him, long and quiet. "Why?" "Because I believe," Kleon said, "that the roots of motivation begin in wonder, but they grow in discipline. I want to guide others toward their own becoming." The philosopher smiled, a rare, full smile. "Then go. You are ready." Kleon began his travels shortly after. Through villages and cities, across the rocky trails of the Peloponnesus and the coasts of Ionia, he shared what he had gathered, not dogma, but questions. He sat with fishermen at dusk and asked them what made them rise at dawn. He knelt beside weavers and asked what beauty meant to them. He spoke to soldiers and scholars, mothers and masons, and always listened more than he spoke. In time, he was no longer called Kleon, the potter's son. He became known as Kleon the Guide, not because he claimed wisdom, but because he helped others remember what they already carried inside. One day, decades later, he returned to Athens. The Lyceum was quieter, older. Aristotle had long passed, but his ideas still echoed in every stone. Kleon found his father's old workshop, now run by another. He stood outside for a while, watching the kiln burn, the wheel turn. Then he walked to the grove, the same place where he once hid, barefoot and wide-eyed. He sat beneath the cypress and opened his final tablet. He etched just one line. Discipline is the love we give to our purpose, even when the world forgets it. As he carved the words, he smiled. He hadn't become great by chasing greatness. He had become whole by remaining true.